Khamenei also believes that time may be on his side. In the last year and a half, we've seen the overthrow of pro-American regimes within the Arab world. The overthrow of President Mubarak in Egypt, for example, who could be on his deathbed as we speak. Revolts in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Tunisia, and so on. And so Khamenei believes that Iran and the United States are engaged in a battle for influence within the region, and that this might benefit Iran. Khamenei doesn't call it the Arab Spring as we call it in the United States. We call it the Arab Spring. He calls it the Islamic Awakening. And he claims that the Arabs in the region were inspired by Iran's revolution of 1979. Contrary to evidence we have of what's going on in the Arab world, no serious analyst within the United States, really without or outside of Iran, would tell you that the Arabs are revolting because of Iran's revolution, because the Islamic Republic has not created a role model for the Arab world that would be conducive to their interests. But this is nevertheless what Khamenei believes, and this is what the people around him are telling him, that the US is declining in the Middle East and globally because of the financial crisis, and that time may be on his side. And of course, Khamenei has become more dictatorial in his style of ruling and decision-making in the last few years. He no longer relies on reformist and less ideological figures within Iran that may tell him otherwise, that may tell him, look, your regime is in trouble. The Arab uprisings are not because of the Islamic Revolution, that Iran has been hurt by the uprisings. He has sidelined figures like Ayatollah Rafsanjani, the former president, who believes that sanctions are not a joke. Ahmadinejad, the president, has claimed that Iran can withstand the sanctions, but there are other figures within Iran who think that Khamenei may be pursuing a dangerous path, that he is risking the survival of the regime. And I would argue that Khamenei's viewpoints on the nuclear program and on Iran's foreign policies as a whole are really followed by a minority. The Iranian population appears to support the nuclear program, the civilian aspects of the nuclear program, Iran's right to enrich uranium, but they're not necessarily supportive of nuclear weapons per se. And public opinion polls, including polls I've conducted in Iran, demonstrate this as well. As I said, there are figures within the regime, within the political system, that are unhappy with Khamenei. In fact, some key members of the Revolutionary Guards within Iran have complained about Khamenei's decisions and decision-making style. For example, the former head of the Revolutionary Guards Navy, the general who created the Revolutionary Guards Navy in the Persian Gulf, the same naval force that would fight the United States if there was a conflict with Iran in the region, wrote a letter to an Iranian newspaper several months ago. And in the newspaper, he addressed the former Shah explicitly, but implicitly, he really was talking to Khamenei. And in his letter, he stated, if you had not oppressed the Iranian people, would you still be in power? If you had not resorted to force in meeting your people's demands, would you still be in power today? And Iranians took that as a letter addressed to Khamenei. And he got in trouble for it. Members of the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij paramilitary forces rioted outside his house, but he got away with it. Other figures within the regime came to his defense. A former member of parliament and a senior Revolutionary Guards officer even went on television in Iran and said, the supreme leader has to address the people's concerns. The supreme leader is open to criticism. And I think this is really important. It's unprecedented for such figures to come out and criticize Khamenei very directly. So when we look at the Islamic Republic as a system, there are major cracks and divisions within the system. And I think that sanctions are exacerbating these tensions, that there is not necessarily a monolithic unified system within Iran that's making decisions on the nuclear program. Now, where does this leave us in terms of the policies the United States should pursue? To this day, the Obama administration has pursued a policy of sanctions and diplomacy. If you recall, President Obama made two major Nowruz or New Year speeches, not only to the Iranian people, but to the regime, and he said, extend a hand and we'll shake it, that we're open to negotiations. We want to solve the nuclear crisis peacefully. And so far, the United States has built a very broad and deep international coalition to pressure Iran. The Europeans are going to embargo Iranian oil, and this was not the case under the Bush administration, where the Europeans did not want to go along with US policy necessarily, but the Europeans are on board, and even major Iranian partners such as China, which is Iran's #1 business partner and investor, are reducing ties to Iran. They're freezing their activities in the energy sector. The Russians have voted for UN resolutions against Iran. The Indians are reducing purchase of Iranian oil, as are the South Koreans and the Japanese, and so on and so on. So Iran is really feeling the pressure. And the sanctions are really meant to increase the costs of Iran's nuclear program. If Iran decides to weaponize the program, then it has to face increasing international isolation and sanctions. And from what we know, looking at Khamenei's mindset, he thinks of the nuclear program as an issue of national and revolutionary pride. He claims that Iran has succeeded despite sanctions and isolation. And he may even view an Iranian nuclear weapons capability as deterring a potential US attack in the future, because Khamenei has seen the US overthrow the regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001 and 2003, so he sees value in the nuclear program. At the same time, Khamenei himself has publicly stated that his regime is not interested in nuclear weapons. Khamenei has said that nuclear weapons are anti-Islamic, so he has really created a red line for his regime. And we don't have to believe in Khamenei's sincerity. It's just enough that he says he doesn't want nuclear weapons. And sanctions and US policy toward Iran has tried to operationalize Khamenei's so-called fatwa on nuclear weapons. So we're saying to Khamenei, you've stated you don't want nuclear weapons, prove it. Prove to us you don't want nuclear weapons. And I think the US and the Obama administration deserves a lot of credit for creating this international coalition to really raise the cost of weaponization. I think we're at a point where we can effectively dissuade Iran and prevent it from weaponizing this program if we have enough time. But a lot of people have been talking about military strikes against Iran. Our major ally in the Middle East, Israel, is particularly concerned about an Iranian nuclear weapons capability. And the Israeli leadership, including the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Defense Minister Barak, have talked about damaging Iran's capabilities before it goes toward a weapons capability. Now, I think the military option is very problematic. Israel by itself can only damage Iran's nuclear program. Even Israeli analysts and policymakers, including the former head of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, will tell you that they can set back Iran's program 3 to 5 years, that Iran's facilities are buried deep underground. One of the major facilities is actually inside a mountain, and then the Israelis can't destroy the facility but can damage them. So if Israel strikes Iran, it could damage the program, but the leadership, including Khamenei, can decide, well, we'll kick out the international inspectors and decide to speed up our program and actually cross that red line of weaponizing the program. Now, if Israel doesn't act alone, if the United States decides to strike Iran militarily, there number of other major issues at play, including Iran's retaliation against the US and Israel, and a major war in the region that could lead to increased oil prices and really affect US national security interests negatively. So the military option is clearly the less desirable solution. It's a very bad solution, if you ask me. So what is the solution? Number one, the US should dissuade Iran from weaponizing its program, which we are doing already, but imposing sanctions. The United States should contain the regime's influence within the Middle East. And I really do believe that the Arab uprisings have helped us in this matter. And finally, the best weapon against the nuclear program is democracy in Iran. When we look at Iran as a country, we see a population that is young, that is relatively sophisticated, that does not want to be enemies with the United States or with Israel for that matter. A population that wants to be part of the world, that wants to progress. And I think the Iranian population is our best ally on the nuclear crisis, ultimately. And despite Khamenei's claims that the Arab uprisings have been inspired by the Iranian Revolution, we have to look at reality. The current leader of the Green Movement in Iran, the former Prime Minister Hossein Mousavi, who was under house arrest, has said that the Arab uprisings are not the inspiration of the Islamic Revolution of 1979, but that they were inspired really by the 2009 protests by Iranians, that the region's Arabs were inspired by Iranians going to the streets. And of course, the Green Movement has failed to effect decisive change in Iran. I think it's because of a lack of ultimate objectives and really a lack of leadership. But there's a lot of potential there. And I think a military strike against Iran could really set back the potential of democracy within Iran, which is our long-term objective in that country. So when we look at the nuclear negotiations, when we look at the increasing risk of war with Iran, the prognosis is negative. It's hard to be optimistic. But when I look at Iran as a country, I have a lot of hope for Iran and US-Iranian relations. Thank you.
Since we are in this rather modest informal gathering, I'm going to have a mic and I'll hand the mic to people to ask questions. Good questions. Ask the tough questions about Iran, about US-Iran relations, the future of Iran, war in Iran, and so forth. But we'll start with that.
Obviously, this stalemate of sorts that we have in Iran right now, what's the prognosis on it? You know, at the negotiating table, but where do you see it going?
So one of the issues with the Moscow negotiations is that the Iranian side wants two things from the P5+1. In reality, the United States. Iran wants sanctions relief, and it wants an explicit acknowledgement of its right to enrich uranium. And when you look at the regime's political situation, they have to portray any sort of outcome from the negotiations as a political victory. A few months ago, actually, the Iranian regime started preparing the population, the political elite, for some sort of concession. They started talking about nuclear negotiations and possible Iranian concessions. They don't call them concessions, of course, as a victory. They claim that the P5+1, the West, has recognized Iran's right to enrich uranium. So for them, this is a very politically important issue, especially for the Supreme Leader Khamenei, because he has portrayed Iran's nuclear program as a success against US and Western pressure. Of course, the P5+1 doesn't trust Iran for obvious reasons, and they don't want to give that sort of recognition to Iran up front. They want Iran to do several things first. Number one, to ship out its stockpile of highly enriched uranium that has been enriched to 20%. that stockpile can be used to create nuclear weapons. Iran right now has enough uranium to create about 5 to 6 nuclear weapons, and the P5+1 in the United States want Iran to ship that out. We almost came to an agreement in 2009 for Iran to ship it out. We want that again. We also want Iran to stop activities in the Fordow nuclear site that's buried deep under a mountain, because it is relatively invulnerable to Israeli and even US military strikes. So Iran has to cease those activities. And ultimately, Iran has to open up some of its military sites where the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, suspects that Iran has been carrying out experiments for weaponization, for creating a nuclear weapon device, actually, not just uranium enrichment and creating a device. So this is what the P5+1 wants from Iran. Iran is reluctant to take those steps because it's not certain that they will be reciprocated. So I think the major problem right now is one of sequencing. Each party is afraid to take the first step, and that's why we're in a deadlock.
Green movement, because that Green movement was really becoming very effective against the government. But all of a sudden, and since Mousavi is under house arrest, nothing is happening right now. Why can't we do that?
And I think that's a great question. It's one of the key questions that's under consideration in Washington, D.C. In 2009, the U.S. government did not vocally advocate for the Green movement in Iran, and I think there are several reasons for this. First of all, the Obama administration was worried that if it supported the Green movement, it would jeopardize the nuclear negotiations. You're sitting down with the Iranian regime and asking them to make concessions, but if at the same time you're supporting the political enemies at home, you're going to be less likely to concede. So I think there was a fear in 2009 that US support of the Green movement would contradict US policy objective of stopping the Iranian nuclear weapons program. And to be fair, when you work in the government, you have to react to events. It's hard to react to events as they're happening and making policies because you don't know what's going on. Mousavi did not win. Ahmadinejad and Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guard stayed in power, and those are the same people we have to talk to today. Now, if you ask me today if there are protests in Iran and there's a major uprising, what should the Obama administration do? I would say that we should wholeheartedly support the Green movement in Iran today, because when we look at the nuclear negotiations, it isn't a deadlock. We're not going to achieve what we want from them ultimately, because of the reasons I explained, because of this strategic rivalry between the Islamic Republic and the United States. And so I really think the United States should pay more attention to human rights issues within Iran. That President Obama and the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton should talk about human rights consistently and loudly in Iran, and we should use that as a leverage against the regime, because the regime in Iran is vulnerable to human rights criticism. And given that we will not, I don't think, achieve an ultimate solution to the nuclear crisis or any sort of crisis with this regime as long as Khamenei stays in power, we have to use our credibility as a champion of human rights and democracy.